By the time Ellie was a young girl, her dad had stopped searching the horizon for a cloud or hoping to smell the rain building. The family no longer watered anything except Mum's last rose bush by the back door. The veggie garden next to the veranda had long since dried up and withered away. The only thing moved by any breeze was the dust, which drifted everywhere. Ellie's 7 brothers still remembered the rain and grumbled that there was nowhere to swim and cool off, but little Ellie had never known anything different. Ellie loved to follow her brothers on adventures with Blue, the Kelpie, by her side whenever she wasn't working the sheep. Ellie's short legs struggled to keep up with the boys, but she refused to be left behind and valiantly shadowed them on expeditions that took them far from the house, but always brought them home in time for dinner. Although Ellie wasn't oblivious to her dad's angry shouting when they came back from these ventures, she didn't think much of it. It was always directed at the boys, who were off having bloody fun instead of doing work that needed finishing. The boys would stand around with stubborn expressions or sometimes shout back, a move Ellie always knew was likely to earn them a blow, then storm off in a pack. Ellie was no more than 6 or 7 the night her dad yelled at the boys for the last time. The boys were talking back, always a bad sign, ranged in a tense line just outside the back door. "Just give up, Dad," shouted the eldest. "It's not our fault there's no rain and nothing's changing any time soon." "We're not sticking around just to get yelled at," scowled her younger brother. "There's nothing here for us." "You boys belong on this station and you'd better start showing a bit more interest." Their dad's fists were clenched. "Your mum and I can't run this thing by ourselves. You're part of this family. It's part of your responsibility." "Whatever, Dad." Their dad reached forward and cuffed the boy who'd spoken on the ear. "You're worse than useless," he roared. "Extra mouths to feed and no help. You're like bloody crows, picking off the lambs right in front of me. Just get out! Out!" But something strange had happened to the boys. There was a glance of understanding between them, and they began to shift and ripple under the evening light. A wild wind sprang up out of nowhere, spinning the dust out the back in a willy-willy that snatched up the boys, then settled much too suddenly, leaving behind a small flock of crows that took off, cawing, towards the east. Ellie grew up missing her brothers, and the station missed them too. There was too much work to be done, no matter that Ellie learned to help as best she could. Her dad didn't talk about the boys, just looked angry if someone or something reminded him of them. Ellie asked her mum about them only once. She had just looked sad and said she didn't know if the boys had made their choice or if it had been made for them, but either way, they were gone. By the time Ellie was a young woman, she could lend a capable hand in the shearing sheds among the dust, the moving feet, and the strong scent of lanolin in the air. She liked to tussle with Rue, old Blue's pup, and would sometimes be found sitting up long into the night caring for any abandoned lambs she'd been given to hand-raise. She still missed her brothers, but with a dull kind of ache that went away if she didn't think about it too hard. And the rain still hadn't come. Ellie helped her mum fence off the dams. With the water so low, sheep got caught in the mud and died. Sometimes Ellie helped her dad drag the dead sheep from the paddock. She tried not to look at their thin bodies too closely, or wonder what the flock would eat tomorrow. She heard her parents say they'd never seen a drought this bad before, never so hot or so long, but this was all Ellie had ever known. They talked in lowered tones, so she was only half aware of how worried they were, but when talked into selling up and moving away, she began to pay more attention. She loved the station and couldn't imagine living anywhere else. "It would be different if the boys were still here," Ellie's mum said quietly one night. Ellie tilted her head from where she was bottle feeding a lamb in a shadowy corner. It was so rare for her brothers to be mentioned. "We could keep going if they were here, but without them this station is a burden that is eventually going to fall on Ellie alone." "I know," said her dad, looking defeated, "but they're gone and that's that. Maybe it's just easier to sell up and move towards the coast." He dropped his head into his hands. Ellie stayed awake all night. The only way she could see to keep the home she loved was to bring her brothers back. The more she thought about them, the stronger her memories felt, and she missed her brothers keenly. Before the morning light could wake her parents, she packed a bag, filling it with the most precious thing she could think of, water. Bottles and bottles of it. She slipped out into the night, where the biting chill was not quite enough to smother the warmth still in the ground beneath her feet. It wasn't until she'd gone a long way that she realised Rue had followed her, and by then it was too late to turn back. At first, Ellie and Rue walked east, the direction her brothers had flown. Eventually they came to the sun. Ellie resolved to ask it for help, for the sun shone all day, and if anyone had seen her brothers during the long days, it was the sun. "There's no rain and my brothers are gone," Ellie began. "Please can you tell me where they are?" But the sun was angry and glared down at Ellie, burning her skin and her eyes. "You caused this, not me," he shouted angrily. Ellie stood her ground as well as she was able. "I didn't make the drought or send them away," she shouted back. "You all look the same to me," said the sun, and Ellie was forced to retreat under a tree. Next, Ellie asked the moon, for if her brothers were anywhere to be found each night, surely the moon had looked down on them. But the moon was cold and indifferent. "I might have seen them, I might not. What do I care?" "Please," cried Ellie, "I need them back. We can't survive the drought without them." "What's a drought to me?" asked the moon. "I only move the water. It doesn't move me." Finally, Ellie came to the stars, who twinkled and smiled so gently and kindly. The stars were compassionate. "We have seen your brothers. They are in the glass mountains far away." The stars gave Ellie a little key made all of bone to get inside the tallest glass mountain and show her the direction to travel. Ellie and Rue walked and walked. Sometimes they were lucky and hitched a lift a short distance, but soon they were back to walking. Occasionally they passed through a small neglected town made up of a few old buildings, perhaps an empty church or a railway station long abandoned. Everywhere the earth was dry and red, the bushes and trees sparse and brown with dust. They refilled the water bottles where they could and made the water last where they could not. After a long time, Ellie and Rue came to a place of endless lights and buildings, with more people and movement than Ellie could imagine. Despite the hazy smog that settled over everything, it was greener than she'd ever seen. Everywhere water was running from hoses, sprinklers and fountains. Far on the horizon, huge shapes pointed upward, light glancing off them in jagged reflections that seared Ellie's eyes even at a distance, and she knew that these must be the glass mountains. She walked fearlessly through the sprawling city, and it was just as well she was brave, for someone with less courage would have faltered under the looks the city folk gave this dirty, dusty young woman and her dog. At last she reached the tallest buildings. Each one could be a glass mountain to Ellie's wide, unaccustomed eyes. But in which one would she find her brothers? This one, with stone and glass cleverly intertwined? That one, with glass, metal and concrete that felt poised to crush those below it? Another, where glass was illuminated by flashing lights that spelt out words in many languages. She walked on, Rue close by her heels, ears drooping and head down, both bewildered by the noise and weight of the place, the press of people, and the maze-like quality of the streets. Finally, in the very centre of the city, stood the largest building of all. It loomed over Ellie, and every facet was glass. Each side seemed impenetrable, and it glinted viciously, victoriously, raised above everyone, a glass mountain indeed. Ellie approached it carefully, tentatively. She took out the handkerchief that contained the little bone key that the kind stars had given her, but alas! The key had been jostled against the water bottles all through the long journey and was crushed into 1,000 fragments. Ellie struck her fists on the glass and shouted, but the glass mountain remained unassailable. Its vaguely threatening presence meant even those accustomed to it walked a little faster as they passed, and no one paid attention to Ellie's cries of frustration. But Ellie was determined and daring and had not come this far to give up. She could see the one chink of weakness in the glass mountain, the one spot a small bone key would fit. Somehow, she did not know how, Ellie knew there was only one way to reach her brothers. With a deep breath, gritting her teeth and with Rue comfortingly by her side, she took a knife and cut off the smallest finger from her hand. Slicing through bone was no small task. Panting, blood soaking the handkerchief wrapped around her hand, she stumbled to the lock and pressed her severed finger into it. Silently, previously invisible doors slid open, and Ellie toppled inside. The silence of the interior was oppressive. There was nothing but empty space on the ground floor, but she could find no stairs to go higher. Eventually she stumbled into a strange glass box full of buttons with arrows pointing upward. She pressed the highest button, heard the mechanism whir, and felt herself lifted up. Through the dark glass walls she could see the whole city fall away below her, stretching on and on. As she went higher, she could see the red dirt beyond and a dust storm in the distance. Finally, the doors opened, and Ellie and Rue found themselves at the top of the glass mountain. In each direction, glass was all that stood between them and a fall to ground barely visible so far below. In the middle of the room was a long table, spread with an extravagant banquet. Ellie was bewildered by the unfamiliar food, but she was hungry, so she tasted a little from each plate and drank a little wine from each glass. She sat down in a large armchair facing one of the glass walls and swiftly fell asleep. Ellie was woken by a terrible wind. The top of the mountain had opened, and the wind roared inside, rattling the glass, shaking the cups on the table, and whirring past Ellie so that Rue whined beside her. In the midst of the wind, Ellie saw dark shapes fly into the room. The wind only seemed to increase as they shook themselves, lengthening, standing straighter, shaking off their suits of feathers until suddenly, like closing a door, the wind stopped and they stood there as men. Her brothers, for there could be no doubt who they were, did not notice Ellie in their haste to sit down to their meal, but they each quickly saw that a bite had been taken from their food. They all spoke at once, their voices tumbling over each other. "Who has eaten my food?" said the eldest. "Who has drunk my wine?" said the youngest, who was barely older than Ellie. "Who is this?" cried one in wonder, looking at Rue, who was warily sniffing the feathers on the floor. "She looks just like old... what was her name?" "Blue," shouted a brother. "She looks like Blue." Ellie slowly stood up from the chair and walked towards them. "Blue died a long time ago, I'm afraid, but Rue here is her daughter." The brothers stared at her, shocked into absolute silence for a moment. Then one stepped forward and falteringly, so slowly, reached out to hold Ellie's shoulders and look into her face. "Little Ellie?" he whispered. "I am," she said, smiling and almost in tears. "I've come to bring you home," and she hugged him tightly. "Oh, Ellie." He stepped back to arm's length, brushing at his eye. "I'm not going home." Ellie looked at them more closely, past the familiarity of their faces to the costly clothes, heavy watches and soft leather shoes. "We need you at home," she cried. "You don't know how it's been out there, what you left us to." Ellie saw a flicker of anger across several faces. Then they shrugged and turned back to eating the rich food and drinking the dark red wine. But two brothers, the oldest and the youngest, loosened their ties and sat down with Ellie by the glass wall. "Tell us about home," they said, and Ellie did. In the end, only these two brothers returned with Ellie, but from their parents' happiness you'd have thought she'd brought them all. The city had claimed the others, and nothing could convince them to ever again call the station home. As they walked up the long driveway, the rain was already building. The smell was heavy in the air, entirely new to Ellie, but it stopped her parents and brothers from talking as they all took deep, contented breaths, smiling like she'd never seen. When the winds changed a day later, bringing the rain, it felt like hope.